Hello and welcome, sleepy friend. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we drift into the story, make yourself comfortable. Settle into bed or your favorite cozy chair. Put on your headphones, adjust the volume to a soft, gentle level. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Feel your body relax from the top of your head down to your shoulders, your arms, your chest, your belly, your hips, your legs, and all the way to your toes. As we begin tonight's journey, remember, all the stories you hear are 100% factual. The real moments, real people, real places that shaped history. If you enjoy this bedtime journey, please remember to like the video, subscribe to Sleepy Time History, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let's drift back, hundreds, even thousands of years ago, to the first peoples of North America. Take a slow, deep breath and settle in. Let your shoulders soften, your eyes grow heavy, and your mind open to the vast landscapes of a country where time stretches back farther than the oldest written page. Tonight, we drift into the story of Canada, a land of ancient ice, resilient peoples, and an unfolding tale still being written under the Northern Lights. Long before there was any talk of confederation, railways, or maple leaf flags, this land was already alive with human footsteps and voices. As far back as 20,000 years ago, when great sheets of ice covered much of what is now Canada, the ancestors of today's First Nations and Inuit peoples began their slow, patient journeys across a land bridge that connected Asia to North America. These early families didn't arrive all at once. They came in waves, following migrating herds, rivers, and seasons, carving out lives in a landscape that could be both bountiful and brutal. As the ice retreated, vast forests emerged, deep lakes formed, and herds of bison thundered across wide open plains. Coastal peoples, like the Haida and Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest, crafted cedar canoes that could ride the ocean swells. They raised towering totem poles to mark their stories and family lineages, stories carried from generation to generation by word of mouth, not ink and paper. In the East, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Iroquois Confederacy built vibrant communities among the rivers and forests, their longhouses echoing with the laughter of children and the steady wisdom of elders. These communities were not isolated pockets. They traded, formed alliances, and sometimes waged war, just as kingdoms did across the Atlantic. Further north, the Inuit mastered the Arctic's unforgiving cold. They carved sled runners from whale bones and stitched warm parkas from caribou hides. They read the snow and ice like books, each wind-swept drift and crack telling a story of survival and migration. These diverse nations, more than 600 distinct First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities today, each carried intricate knowledge of the land. They knew when the salmon would run, when the caribou would cross, how to heal wounds with spruce sap, and how to tell time by the moon's soft glow on a frozen plain. But the land itself was more than a resource, it was family. Mountains, rivers, animals, and ancestors were woven together in a relationship of deep respect. A bend in the river wasn't just a geographic marker. It might be the site of an ancient gathering, a place where stories were sung, treaties were made, or lives were changed forever. When the first Norse explorers, Vikings from Greenland, briefly touched the shores of what is now Newfoundland around the year 1000 AD, they likely encountered these indigenous stewards. The sagas tell of Leif Erikson's Vinland and fleeting settlements, but the Norse did not stay. The land remained, 4 centuries more, under the care and belonging of its first peoples. Centuries later, when European sails rose on the Atlantic horizon once again, it would not be for fleeting visits but for profit, power, and permanent settlement. And though those newcomers wrote many versions of what they called discovery, the people who already called these lands home knew the truth. The forests, the rivers, the ice fields, they had never been empty. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine standing on the eastern edge of the land we now call Canada. The wind carries salt from the Atlantic, and the waves lap at your feet. Somewhere inland, smoke curls from a distant longhouse, a sign that people gather, stories flow, and life beats steadily on this ancient soil. Breathe in that crisp, northern air. Let the sound of paddles dipping into water, of moccasins on forest paths, and the echo of drums guide you back through time. Know that these stories of the first peoples are not forgotten whispers but living threads that connect the past to the present, and that this is where Canada's true story begins. Sleep easy, dear listener, for the land remembers. Take another calming breath, and let the world of ancient forests, winding rivers, and icy bays surround you. You're standing now in a time when Europe's age of exploration first cast its gaze across the Atlantic, drawn by rumors of fish so plentiful they could be caught by the basketful, forests of towering timber, and the dream of a fabled northwest passage to the riches of Asia. The year is the late 1400s, and Europe is stirring with bold ambition and restless seas. Ships bearing the crests of kings and queens drift further west than ever before. Tales of Vinland, the Norse settlement in Newfoundland, have faded into legend, but the hunger for new routes and new lands remains. It was in 1497 that the Italian-born navigator John Cabot, sailing under the English flag of King Henry VII, made his landfall on the rugged shores of Newfoundland, or possibly Cape Breton Island. His brief expedition is often credited as the rediscovery of the North American coastline for England, although to the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, and Innu, there was nothing to rediscover, only the newcomers to be met with caution and curiosity. Cabot's crew found codfish so abundant that they claimed baskets could be lowered into the water and hauled up brimming without a single hook baited. Word of this maritime bounty spread fast. Soon, Basque, Portuguese, and French fishermen flocked to the Grand Banks, vast underwater plateaus teeming with life where cold Arctic currents met the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream. Picture the fog rolling thick over those waters, sails cutting ghost-like through the mist. Wooden dories bobbed between icebergs and seabirds swooped low, their cries echoing across the waves. On shore, summer camps of fishers salted and dried their catch on racks of spruce. Some traded knives, beads, and iron kettles for furs with the local Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. These early exchanges were tentative, first steps toward a relationship that would soon reshape the continent. As the 16th century dawned, France emerged as the dominant European power in these northern reaches. In 1534, Jacques Cartier, a bold mariner from St. Malo, was commissioned by King Francis I to seek riches and claim lands in the name of France. Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, an inland sea so vast that it seemed to him like an open door to Asia itself. He planted a cross on the Gaspe Peninsula, claiming the land for his king, while the nearby Micmac and St. Lawrence Iroquoians watched from a wary distance. On subsequent voyages, Cartier and his men ventured up the mighty St. Lawrence River, a highway of water that had been the lifeblood of indigenous communities for millennia. They encountered Hochelaga, a fortified village at the base of a great mountain that Cartier called Mont Royal, the place we now know as Montreal. Imagine the bustling village of Hochelaga in its prime. Long houses made of wood and bark clustered in a circle, families tending fields of corn, beans, and squash, children playing near the riverbank. For the Iroquoian people, these lands were not empty wilderness, but a cultivated home with trails and trade routes stretching far in every direction. Cartier's attempts to establish a permanent settlement were thwarted by harsh winters, scurvy, and conflict with local peoples who rightly resisted the imposition of foreign flags and demands. By the early 1600s, another explorer, Samuel de Champlain, a skilled mapmaker and diplomat, would succeed where Cartier could not. Champlain's vision was not only to find riches but to build alliances. In 1608, he founded a settlement on the cliffs above the St. Lawrence, a place called Quebec in the Algonquin tongue, meaning where the river narrows. This outpost would become Quebec City, the cradle of New France. Close your eyes and stand on those early ramparts. Picture Champlain in a broad-brimmed hat and doublet, gazing out over the swirling waters where the river squeezed between rocky promontories. Behind him, a handful of timber buildings clung to the hillside. Beyond the settlement, dense forests pulsed with life, moose, beavers, and the people whose lives were intertwined with the land. Champlain knew the survival of this fragile foothold depended on friendship and trade with local nations. He forged alliances with the Algonquin, Innu, and Huron-Wendat, exchanging European tools, beads, and weapons for furs, especially beaver pelts, which were prized in Europe for making stylish felt hats. This fur trade became the backbone of New France and drew more adventurers westward into the heart of the continent. These coureurs de bois, the wood runners, slipped their canoes along endless waterways, learning indigenous ways of travel and survival. They paddled rivers that seemed to go on forever, camping under the stars beside new allies and sometimes forming families that gave rise to the Métis people, whose mixed heritage would become an essential thread in Canada's story. Yet for all the early cooperation, misunderstandings and conflicts were never far behind. The introduction of European diseases, to which indigenous peoples had no immunity, spread like wildfire. Entire villages were emptied by smallpox, measles, and influenza. The arrival of guns disrupted old balances of power. Alliances shifted, and ancient rivalries were inflamed by new technologies and the insatiable appetite for furs. Meanwhile, rival European powers eyed New France with envy. The English and the Dutch sought footholds further south along the Atlantic seaboard and the Hudson Bay. By the mid-17th century, a vast competitive fur trade stretched from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, and from the St. Lawrence to Hudson Bay, crisscrossed by voyagers, indigenous traders, and missionaries whose black robes and Latin prayers mingled with the chants of forest camps. Can you see it all unfolding? Birch bark canoes gliding silently at dawn, the slap of paddles on water, the soft drumbeat of moccasins along forest trails. A Jesuit missionary writing in his journal by candlelight. A Wendat elder teaching a young boy how to trap beaver along the banks of a still, icy creek. These moments are the heartbeat of early Canada, fragile encounters that would set the stage for centuries of cooperation, conflict, and survival. As you breathe deeply, drifting deeper into rest, know that these river routes and forest paths still hold the echoes of those who came before. The story of Canada, like the rivers themselves, is winding, resilient, and ever-changing. And here, in the early days of New France, it was only just beginning. Take another deep, calming breath and settle back into your blanket. Let the hush of old pine forests and winding rivers cradle you as we continue this journey through the unfolding story of Canada. The little settlement at Quebec has taken root, but the wild, vast land beyond its palisades is drawing traders, missionaries, and adventurers deeper into a continent of endless horizons. By the mid-1600s, New France is still just a thread along the St. Lawrence River, a fragile ribbon of farms, for outposts, and a handful of small towns where priests, soldiers, settlers, and merchants all cling to the hope that this distant territory can thrive. The beaver hat remains all the rage in European cities, fueling a fur trade that becomes the economic heartbeat of the colony. In those early years, life was a delicate balance between survival and ambition. The habitants, as the French settlers called themselves, carved narrow strips of farmland out of thick forest, each plot stretching inland from the river like the teeth of a comb. This way, everyone had access to the water, their highway, lifeline, and link to the wider world. Beyond the neat rows of crops and log homes, the wilderness was not empty. It teemed with life and with people whose stories stretched back long before the French arrived. The Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Innu, and dozens more, each nation played a vital role in the fur trade network, paddling canoes filled with pelts from deep in the forests to trading posts like Tadoussac and Trois-Rivières. But the wealth and influence of this trade also stirred tensions. Alliances were tested. Rivalries flared. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois, powerful and organized, pushed northward to secure better access to fur routes and European guns. The Beaver Wars, as some historians later called them, saw indigenous nations fighting not only for survival but for control of the new trade wealth that now flowed through their lands. It was a time of shifting alliances and unsteady truces. French missionaries, known as the Black Robes, traveled upriver and deep into the forests, hoping to convert indigenous families to Catholicism. Some communities welcomed them. Others saw the missionaries as unwanted intruders or even harbingers of disease. Smallpox, influenza, and measles devastated entire villages, cutting deep wounds that would echo for generations. Yet in the heart of this wilderness, a distinct figure emerged, the coureurs de bois. These were the young Frenchmen who slipped away from the rigid life of the settlements, taking to the rivers and forests to trade directly with distant communities. They learned indigenous languages, married into local nations, and adopted skills of hunting, trapping, and survival that no map or European textbook could teach. Picture them now, paddling birch-bark canoes under towering pines, singing paddle songs that echoed across glassy lakes at dawn. Their packs bulged with metal goods, axes, knives, copper kettles, exchanged for beaver pelts worth fortunes back in Paris. These coureurs de bois became the arteries of a trade network that stretched from the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way to the western Great Lakes. By the late 1600s, the fur trade had grown too vast for lone traders and informal deals. The French crown sought more control, and so was born the era of the great fur trade companies. The most legendary of these would be the Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670 under an English charter. Two French explorers, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers, had pitched the idea of a northern route via Hudson Bay directly to the English, frustrated that New France's leaders would not back their bold plan. The English King Charles II granted them a royal charter, giving the Hudson's Bay Company control of all lands draining into the enormous inland sea. Suddenly, English traders were not just coastal rivals but were setting up posts deep in the north, cutting into territory claimed by New France and reshaping old trade patterns. Imagine the frozen shores of Hudson Bay in winter. Snowdrifts pile against the wooden palisades of trading forts like York Factory or Moose Factory. Inside, traders huddle by the hearth, tallying inventories of muskrat, marten, and beaver pelts. Outside, Cree and Ojibwe trappers arrive on snowshoes, hauling sleds heavy with furs. Each meeting is a blend of commerce and ceremony, gifts exchanged, pipes smoked, and promises made in a swirl of languages. Back along the St. Lawrence, life in the settlements remained harsh but determined. Women, the filles du roi, or king's daughters, were sent from France by the crown to boost the colony's population, marrying farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen to help grow a French Catholic society in the New World. These women brought courage, resilience, and a new generation of Canadians born in the shadow of endless forests. Meanwhile, the rivalry between France and England simmered like an unattended kettle on the hearth. Their conflicts in Europe spilled into North America again and again, the colonies drawn into larger imperial wars that saw forts built and burned, alliances shift, and families displaced. As you drift deeper into your rest, imagine the distant echoes of cannon fire along the banks of the St. Lawrence. Picture soldiers in blue and red coats marching through snow, their boots crunching over frozen rivers, their muskets gleaming in the pale winter sun. Think, too, of the families who huddled together in rough-hewn homes, praying that peace would return before spring's first thaw. Through all this turmoil, indigenous nations remained powerful players, negotiating, resisting, adapting. They were never passive bystanders. Some fought alongside the French, others the English, and many sought to protect their communities from both. Their choices shaped the course of history as much as any king's edict or fur trader's scheme. And so the stage was set for a century of shifting borders and loyalties. A land of countless rivers and ancient forests, now divided on parchment maps by men who would never walk those winter trails themselves. As you drift further into sleep, let your mind wander through these early frontiers. See the coureurs de bois gliding across misty lakes, the traders greeting Cree and Anishinaabe families at frozen Hudson Bay posts, the filles du roi tending gardens behind timber palisades, and the elders of the First Nations, gathered around a flickering fire, speaking of old treaties, new threats, and dreams for the generations yet to come. This is the heartbeat of Canada in its formative years, rugged, resilient, ever-changing. The rivers still remember. The forests still hold the whispers of the fur trade and the stories of all who called these lands home. Sleep well, dear listener. The journey carries on. Close your eyes and let your breathing soften as we step deeper into Canada's winding story. The fur trade is in full swing, rivers are busy with canoes, and Europe's ambitions clash and collide on this vast northern stage. By the early 1700s, the rivalry between France and England in North America is no longer just a whisper. It is a storm building on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, European monarchs draw lines on maps and sign treaties to end wars that leave old enemies smoldering with new resentment. Each signature in a gilded palace echoes thousands of miles away in the snow-covered forts, indigenous villages, and remote clearings where settlers cling to life in New France. Picture the villages of New France now. Narrow fields carved from the forest, stone churches ringing with the toll of bells calling habitants to mass, the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys through crisp winter air. These settlers, hardy farmers, trappers and priests, live under the constant threat of raids and siege, yet they keep building, planting, and hoping. The indigenous nations, too, watch these conflicts with wary eyes. They understand that the battles of European empires spill blood far from royal courts. Old alliances are tested. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Mi'kmaq, each must navigate a dangerous dance of diplomacy, resistance, and survival. The early 1700s bring a series of conflicts known collectively as the French and Indian Wars, part of the larger struggle called the 7 Years' War by Europeans. To the people living on this continent, the names matter less than the reality. Forts burned to the ground, crops trampled under soldiers' boots, families forced to flee. One of the pivotal clashes takes place at Louisbourg, a mighty fortress perched on Cape Breton Island. Built by the French to guard the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Louisbourg is a marvel of military engineering. Stone walls bristling with cannon, barracks bustling with soldiers, and harbors packed with ships ready to trade or fight. Imagine the wind howling off the Atlantic as British warships appear on the horizon in 1745. After weeks of siege, Louisbourg falls to New England colonial forces aided by the British Navy. The fortress changes hands more than once before the final showdown between Britain and France would decide the fate of Canada once and for all. That final reckoning came in 1759, the year of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. On a September morning, British General James Wolfe and his men scale the cliffs below Quebec City under the cover of darkness. French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, commanding the defenders, gathers his forces on the fields outside the city walls. It is said the battle lasted less than an hour, yet its echoes still shape Canada today. Wolfe and Montcalm both die in the fighting, young men, their destinies forever tied to this windswept battlefield above the St. Lawrence. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France surrenders its North American colonies to Britain. New France is gone in name, but its people, culture, and legacy endure. Now under British rule, the Canadians, the descendants of those early French settlers, face a new reality. Their language, faith, and customs remain, but their political masters have changed. The British must figure out how to govern a French Catholic majority, while also attracting new English-speaking settlers to balance the scales. Meanwhile, the indigenous nations who once traded and allied with the French find their world upended. Some had fought alongside the French, others with the British, but in the aftermath, they all confront new challenges. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempts to draw a line between indigenous lands and settler expansion, but in practice, the pressure to push westward will only grow stronger. In the south, another revolution is brewing. 13 British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard rebel against the Crown, igniting the American Revolutionary War. When independence is declared in 1776, the winds of change blow northward too. Many Loyalists, those who remained faithful to Britain, flee the turmoil and settle in what will become Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Some bring enslaved black people with them, while others include black Loyalists who fought for the British in exchange for freedom, seeking a new life far from the chaos of the former colonies. These newcomers carve out settlements like Shelburne, Birchtown, and Queen's Bush, communities that carry the scars and dreams of those who refused to bend to revolution. The roots of English Canada take hold alongside the old French roots of Quebec. As the 1800s dawn, the patchwork of British colonies in North America grows more complex. To the west, fur traders push deeper into the prairies and beyond the Rockies. The Hudson's Bay Company, still powerful, competes with the Northwest Company, a fiery upstart of Montreal merchants and rugged voyagers. Picture the voyagers now, paddling great birch-bark canoes stacked high with trade goods, singing songs to keep the paddles moving in rhythm. Their red sashes and tasseled caps flash like bright flags against the dark water and green forest. Portages are grueling work, lifting those canoes and cargo over rocky, mosquito-infested trails, feet sinking into muck, shoulders aching under the weight. These men, often French-Canadian, Métis, and Indigenous, form the backbone of a fur trade empire that stretches thousands of miles. Forts like Fort William and York Factory buzz with life every summer as brigades of canoes arrive to unload pelts, restock supplies, and trade news gathered from the far edges of the wilderness. But this era of expansion is not without consequence. Indigenous nations who once controlled the fur trade routes face mounting pressure as settlers follow behind the traders. Diseases continue to spread, displacing communities, and new treaties are signed, sometimes under great duress, to open lands for farming and towns. In this swirl of change, a new people emerge, the Métis. Born of the unions between indigenous women and European traders, the Métis form distinct communities across the prairies, with their own language, Michif, and their own vibrant culture blending traditions from both sides of their ancestry. Their bison hunts, fiddle music, and Red River carts become iconic symbols of the West. Yet even as the fur trade connects distant lands, the dream of a united Canada, one nation from sea to sea, remains a distant idea. Rivalries, geography, and competing loyalties stand in the way. But in the decades ahead, these scattered colonies and trading posts will find themselves drawn together by railways, rebellions, and the promise of confederation. So, breathe deep now. Let the mist of northern lakes settle in your mind. Hear the creak of a canoe under the weight of furs, the crackle of a fire at a voyager's camp, the low hum of old treaties spoken in half-forgotten tongues. The forests remember. The rivers remember. And your journey into the story of Canada drifts ever onward. Take a deep breath, settle under your blanket, and imagine the wide expanse of the Canadian landscape opening before you once more. It's the early 1800s now, a century of great change for the patchwork of colonies that will one day call themselves Canada. The fur trade still pulses through the rivers and forests like a heartbeat, but the world around it is shifting. Vast new lands, rolling prairies, towering mountains, and rocky coasts lie ahead. For thousands of years, these places have been home to hundreds of indigenous nations, each with their own laws, stories, and ways of life. But now, the push for expansion brings waves of settlers, surveyors, and speculators, eager to lay claim to this immense land. Imagine Red River in what is now Manitoba. The Metis community has grown strong here, a people born from the unions of European fur traders and indigenous women, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux. They are expert hunters, fishers, and farmers, moving between the worlds of the European traders and the ancient traditions of the plains. Their Red River carts creak along the buffalo trails, loaded with pemmican, a nutritious mix of dried meat and fat that fuels voyagers and traders for weeks at a time. Their fiddles echo across the prairie nights. But the Metis soon find themselves caught between powerful interests. The Hudson's Bay Company, which still controls massive tracts of Rupert's land, and new settlers arriving with land grants and deeds in hand. Meanwhile, to the east, the old French colony of Quebec has become Lower Canada under British rule, and Ontario is known as Upper Canada. Loyalists, soldiers, and immigrants from Britain pour in. Timber camps rise along the rivers, sawmills buzz, and towns like Toronto and Ottawa begin to grow from muddy clearings to bustling settlements. The War of 1812 breaks out when the young United States turns its eyes northward, hoping to seize British North America. Indigenous warriors play a vital role in defending the land. Chief Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, stands beside British General Isaac Brock to hold the line. Together they achieve a stunning victory at Detroit, but Tecumseh's vision of a united indigenous confederacy is cut short when he falls in battle at the Thames River. The war ends in stalemate, but it sparks a sense of identity in the colonies. They've defended their homes against a powerful neighbor. Stories of Laura Secor's midnight trek to warn British troops and Indigenous scouts become part of a budding Canadian legend. Through these decades, treaties are signed with Indigenous nations across what will become Ontario and the prairies. These agreements, made under varying levels of understanding and duress, open the floodgates for settlement. The promise to share the land is made, but the reality often falls short. Reserves are created, hunting grounds are restricted, and traditional ways of life are disrupted forever. As the 1800s roll on, the dream of a united Canada grows louder. Leaders like John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine speak of forging a confederation that can stand strong beside its powerful American neighbor. The British Empire, eager to offload the costs of defending far-flung colonies, is willing to support the idea. Yet the path is not smooth. Different provinces hold different dreams. French-speaking Quebec fears losing its culture and language in an English-dominated nation. The Maritimes worry about being overshadowed by the wealth and population of Upper and Lower Canada. The Indigenous nations, who have lived on these lands since time immemorial, are rarely invited to these conversations that carve up their homelands. Still, in 1867, a moment comes that will forever shape the map. The British North America Act is signed. For provinces, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, unite as the Dominion of Canada. A new flag is raised, not yet the red maple leaf we know today, but the Union Jack fluttering over forts and parliaments. Picture the newly minted capital Ottawa, Parliament Hill, a construction site perched above the swirling waters of the Ottawa River, wooden scaffolding clinging to the Gothic towers of what will become a symbol of Canadian democracy. But the dream does not stop at 4 provinces. Leaders imagine Canada from sea to sea, stretching to the Pacific and even the Arctic. This vision depends on railways, ribbons of iron that can bind forest and prairie, mountain and bay, into one vast country. So begins the push westward. British Columbia, lured by the promise of a transcontinental railway, joins Confederation in 1871. To make this railway a reality, workers arrive from all corners of the world, thousands from China, Ireland, and Europe. They carve tunnels through granite, build trestles over gorges, and lay track across the vast plains. The work is brutal and dangerous. Many lives are lost, especially among the Chinese laborers who face low pay, terrible conditions, and deep prejudice. Yet their sweat and sacrifice make the impossible possible. Steel rails spanning a continent, connecting fishing villages on the Atlantic with harbors on the Pacific. But this national dream comes at a steep price for indigenous peoples. As settlers pour in along the railway lines, the bison herds that once thundered across the plains vanish, hunted to near extinction. For the Plains Cree, the Blackfoot, the Assiniboine, and the Métis, this loss is catastrophic. In 1885, tensions erupt in the Northwest Rebellion. The Métis, led by Louis Riel, take up arms once more, demanding recognition of their land and rights. Riel, once exiled, returns to stand with his people at Batoche. After a brief but fierce struggle, the rebellion is crushed. Riel is tried and executed for treason, a decision that fractures the country along cultural lines and leaves a wound in the story of Canada that would take generations to heal. In the East, immigrants keep coming, Irish fleeing famine, Scots driven from the Highlands, Italians and Eastern Europeans seeking work in factories and mines. New communities spring up, bustling Halifax, industrial Hamilton, and multicultural Montreal. Slowly, Canada grows from a fragile union of provinces into a country of contradictions, vast yet connected, diverse yet seeking a shared identity. Tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, hold this image in your mind, a vast land stitched together by rivers, railways, treaties, and the stories of millions who called it home, long before it was ever called Canada. The forests remember. The prairies remember. And so, in your dreams, may you remember too. Close your eyes and imagine the rails of the Canadian Pacific Railway stretching across a continent, a ribbon of steel binding the Atlantic to the Pacific, the Rockies to the prairies. It is the late 1800s now. Canada is young but restless, eager to prove it can hold together the vastness it has claimed. Picture the moment in 1885 when the last spike is driven at Craigellachie, British Columbia. The hammer falls, iron meets iron, and a nation dares to dream that distance can be conquered by sheer human will. But behind the photographs of politicians shaking hands stand the thousands who built this dream, many of them Chinese laborers who endured bitter cold, blasting through mountains, and dangerous dynamite blasts for meager pay and little recognition. Beyond the railway, communities begin to blossom along its path. Prairie towns spring up overnight. Places like Regina, Calgary, and Edmonton, once mere trading posts, now promise a new life for settlers from Europe and Eastern Canada. Farmers break the soil, planting wheat in endless rows that will feed distant cities and nations. But for indigenous peoples, these rails often bring more hardship than hope. Treaties, promised to protect their lands and ways of life, are broken in spirit if not in letter. The bison herds, once millions strong, are nearly wiped out, undermining the food source and economy that sustained Plains nations for generations. Residential schools begin to appear during this era too, part of a government policy to assimilate indigenous children into European ways of life. Run by churches and backed by law, these institutions remove children from their families, languages, and cultures. The impact of this system will echo painfully through the decades and is part of Canada's story that must be remembered. As the 20th century dawns, waves of new immigrants arrive. Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Scandinavians, each family brings seeds of hope, new traditions, and the sweat to till tough prairie soil. They build sod houses to survive the bitter winters and carve out churches, schools, and barns where none stood before. In the East, cities like Montreal and Toronto grow taller and busier. Factories roar to life. Ships steam out of Halifax packed with goods. Canada's economy shifts from fur and fish to steel, timber, and grain. Then comes 1914 and the Great War. Canada, as part of the British Empire, is swept into a global conflict. Over 600,000 Canadians serve overseas. The battles of Ypres, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele leave deep scars, and a growing sense that Canada's sacrifice should earn it a stronger voice in the world. At Vimy Ridge in 1917, four Canadian divisions fight together for the first time. They achieve what other armies could not, capturing the ridge at a terrible cost. This battle becomes a symbol, a moment when Canadians see themselves not just as British subjects but as a people with a distinct identity. Back home, women step into factories and farms to fill roles left empty by the men at the front. The suffrage movement gains momentum. By the war's end, women in most provinces win the right to vote, a step toward equality that will continue to evolve. The war ends, but the scars remain. Thousands return home wounded in body and mind. Many don't return at all. And yet, Canada finds itself more united than before, its place on the world stage secured. The 1920s bring hope and hardship. Wheat prices soar, prairie farms flourish, and cities buzz with jazz and dance halls. But the good times do not last. The stock market crash of 1929 triggers the Great Depression. Drought chokes the prairies into dust bowls. Families lose farms, jobs, and hope. Lines for bread and soup grow longer. Many look to government for relief, and for new ideas to fix a broken system. Through it all, Canada's story is one of resilience. Communities lean on each other. Indigenous peoples continue to fight for recognition and rights. New immigrants arrive, seeking refuge and adding their voices to the ever-growing Canadian chorus. By the eve of the Second World War, Canada is stronger, yet its wounds still ache, the legacy of broken treaties, of people displaced, and of cultures threatened with erasure. And yet, the spirit of those who came before, voyagers, farmers, warriors, builders, echoes through each generation. So breathe in the cold prairie wind, the ocean salt, the forests pine. In your dreams tonight, Remember the steel rails laid across an impossible land, the thousands who built them, and the millions who found hope at the end of the line. Take a deep breath and settle in as the story of Canada moves into the mid-20th century, a time of war, rebuilding, and the slow rise of a new national identity. As the 1930s fade into memory, the world once again edges toward conflict. In 1939, when Britain declares war on Nazi Germany, Canada joins the fight not merely as a British colony, but as an independent nation choosing its own path. More than 1 million Canadians serve in uniform during the Second World War, men and women alike. From the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Europe, they stand shoulder to shoulder with Allied forces, driven by a sense of duty and the hope of a better world beyond the darkness of war. Picture the young pilots of the Royal Canadian Air Force, braving cold cockpits high above the English Channel. Imagine the Royal Canadian Navy's convoys, weaving through the icy Atlantic, hunted by enemy submarines. And remember the women who keep the home front alive, welding ships, building aircraft, working the fields and factories, and serving in uniform too, as nurses and officers. At home, the war effort pulls Canada out of the economic gloom of the Depression. Factories roar to life, producing tanks, trucks, and planes by the thousands. Communities ration and recycle, families plant victory gardens, and war bonds pay for the bullets and boots needed overseas. When the war finally ends in 1945, Canada emerges changed. It is no longer a fragile dominion clinging to Britain's coattails, but a middle power with a voice of its own. The horrors of the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and the scale of human loss deepen Canadians' desire to build a fairer, more peaceful society. The post-war years bring a baby boom. Suburbs sprawl out from cities, new schools and hospitals rise, and a sense of optimism fills the air. Waves of immigrants arrive, displaced families from Europe, survivors seeking a fresh start, and newcomers from Asia and the Caribbean. Canada's cultural mosaic grows richer, one language, faith, and dish at a time. Yet even in this age of growth, old injustices persist. Japanese Canadians who were forcibly interned during the war struggle to rebuild their lives. Indigenous peoples who served bravely in the war return home to find the same systemic barriers still in place, reserves underfunded, promises unkept, traditions threatened. In 1960, Indigenous peoples finally win the right to vote without having to give up their treaty rights and status. It is a small but important step toward recognition and reconciliation. Meanwhile, Canada's own identity crisis comes to the surface. French-speaking Quebec, proud of its language and culture, grows restless under an English-dominated system. The quiet revolution of the 1960s reshapes Quebec. Old ties to the church loosen, education and industry modernize, and a new wave of nationalism sweeps through. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson brings in bold new ideas. Canada adopts a new national flag, the red and white maple leaf that flies today, symbolizing unity and hope. The country becomes a respected peacekeeper on the world stage, sending soldiers in blue helmets to conflict zones to protect the vulnerable. Through the 1970s, economic booms and busts test the nation's resolve. The oil crisis rattles Alberta's fortunes. In Quebec, the separatist Part 1 Québécois wins power, sparking debates about whether the province should stay or leave confederation altogether. At the same time, Canada opens its doors wider to the world. Immigration reforms end old discriminatory quotas. Families arrive from Hong Kong, India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Africa, each bringing new traditions, foods, and dreams. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, enshrined in the 1982 Constitution, becomes a cornerstone of Canadian democracy. For the first time, Canadians have a document that guarantees their fundamental rights: freedom of expression, equality, and the promise that every voice matters. Yet even with these strides forward, the struggle for justice continues. Indigenous communities call for action on land claims, treaty rights, and the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, which operated well into the 1990s. Survivors speak out, demanding the country reckon with this dark chapter. Through it all, everyday Canadians go about their lives, ice skating on frozen ponds, fishing in quiet bays, working the fields and mines, raising families, and gathering around hockey rinks and campfires, each generation adding its own verse to the long story of this land. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture Canada as a quilt stitched from countless patches, each square telling the story of a people who came here, made mistakes, found hope, and dreamed of something better. A place where peacekeeping and protest walk side by side, where the wilderness remains vast and the cities hum with 1,000 languages. Let the wind off the Rockies carry you further into this story. For Canada's journey, like yours tonight, drifts ever onward. Let your eyes grow heavier now, as the story of Canada enters the final stretch of the 20th century, a time of truth-telling, transformation, and the ever-deepening complexity of identity. The map of the nation is nearly complete, but its soul is still learning how to understand itself. As the 1980s unfold, the tension between unity and division simmers. In Quebec, the question of sovereignty dominates public debate. In 1980, a referendum is held asking Quebecois voters if they wish to negotiate a path to independence. The answer, by a narrow margin, is no. Canada remains whole, but the longing for a deeper recognition of Quebec's culture and language remains. Elsewhere, Indigenous voices are rising, clearer and stronger. The Constitution Act of 1982 includes Section 35, which recognizes and affirms existing Indigenous and treaty rights. It is an important moment, but also one surrounded by questions. How will these rights be honored? How will past wrongs be acknowledged? In 1990, these questions erupt into national attention during the Oka crisis. A land dispute between the Mohawk community of Kanesatake and the town of Oka, Quebec, turns into a 78-day standoff. Armed barricades, military intervention, and powerful images of resistance fill the news. For many Canadians, it is a wake-up call, a reminder that reconciliation is not a word, but a responsibility. Canada's story, from this point forward, becomes increasingly about listening to those whose stories were once silenced. The 1990s are a time of reckoning and renewal. A second referendum in Quebec is held in 1995. This time, the result is even closer. Just over 50% vote to stay. The country breathes a sigh of relief, but also begins to ask deeper questions about what truly binds its people together. Multiculturalism is no longer just a word in policy documents. It is a living reality. Cities like Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal blossom with diversity. Languages, festivals, music, and food from around the world become everyday experiences. In 1996, the last federally run residential school closes. Survivors step forward to tell their stories of loss, of courage, of family, and survival. Their testimonies lay the groundwork for what will become, in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Canada begins to learn that healing cannot begin without truth, and that justice requires listening, truly listening, to the voices of those long ignored. Technology, too, begins to reshape the nation. The Internet connects remote northern communities with global conversations. Cell towers rise beside spruce trees. Canadian inventors, artists, and entrepreneurs help lead the world into a digital future. Yet in the quiet spaces of the land, the boreal forest, the tundra, the endless lakes, the old stories still echo, reminding Canadians that progress should never come at the cost of memory. The new millennium brings fresh challenges. The events of 9/11 reshape global politics and security. Canada participates in military operations in Afghanistan, and the country wrestles with the balance between safety and liberty, action and reflection. Natural disasters, floods, fires, storms, grow more intense and frequent, stirring conversations about climate change, sustainability, and the fragile balance between human life and nature. And through it all, Canada grows, not just in numbers, but in understanding. In 2015, a national election brings a renewed focus on inclusivity and climate policy. The red maple leaf flag, once a symbol of pride for a nation seeking identity, is now worn by peacekeepers, Olympians, artists, and citizens from all walks of life. The symbol remains, but the meaning continues to evolve. Canadians begin to speak more openly about mental health, gender identity, systemic racism, and environmental justice. The journey is far from over, but the path is clearer, a nation that chooses not to forget its past, and not to fear its future. And through every decade, through every challenge and celebration, the land endures. The quiet dignity of the North, the thunder of the Pacific, the deep heartbeat of the prairies, the cold clarity of the Atlantic, and the rivers, always the rivers, carrying stories from one shore to another. Tonight, as you drift further into sleep, let those stories carry you like a canoe on still water. You have journeyed from the glaciers that carved the first trails, to the dreams of confederation, to the voices of protest and renewal. And the story continues. Rest deeper now, drifting with the winds that carry Canada into its 21st century present, a country still balancing past, present, and the ever-shifting dream of what it might yet become. Picture a young family stepping off a plane at Toronto Pearson Airport in the 2010s. They've come from Syria, or Somalia, or the Philippines, part of the newest chapter of newcomers. They stand in the echoing terminal, suitcases at their feet, children wide-eyed and tired. Somewhere in this country, they will find a new home. And in their small acts of courage, Canada grows larger, not smaller. Listen to the hum of urban life, Toronto's skyline, Vancouver's mountain-back streets, Montreal's timeless blend of old Europe and vibrant multicultural flair. Canada's cities are places where you can hear Punjabi on the bus, taste jollof rice in the market, find halal shawarma beside poutine. It is a mosaic, always shifting, each piece glinting in the light of possibility. Yet alongside these new beginnings, the old stories continue to demand voice. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission releases its final report, with 94 calls to action, practical moral steps meant to heal wounds opened by the residential school system. The road to reconciliation is long and imperfect, but its first stones are laid with words of truth and the courage to listen. As the years pass, new challenges rise. The COVID-19 pandemic sweeps the world, and Canada, like so many others, faces isolation, fear, and uncertainty. Streets go quiet, hockey rinks echo with silence, and families gather on screens instead of kitchen tables. Yet communities find ways to care for each other, sewing masks, delivering food, cheering for healthcare workers under apartment balconies. In these moments, you can hear the old Canadian spirit echo, the stubborn resilience of settlers who braved prairie winters, the defiance of indigenous nations who survived colonial erasure, the courage of immigrants who left everything behind to build something new. Canada's environment continues to shape its future. Wildfires scorch the forests of British Columbia and Alberta, reminding everyone of climate change's reach. Floods swell rivers and creep through city streets. And yet, activists, scientists, and ordinary citizens rally to protect what remains: the boreal forests, the Arctic ice, the fragile ecosystems that sustain life. As you lie here now, think of the North. Nunavut, the newest territory, born in 1999, is home to communities who trace their ancestry back thousands of years. The Inuit, guardians of a landscape few Southerners can fully grasp, continue to adapt, balancing ancient ways with modern tools. The Arctic, once imagined as empty and endless, reveals itself as full of stories, knowledge, and sovereignty questions that the rest of the world is only beginning to understand. And in the cities, conversations bloom about what it means to belong. Pride parades shine rainbow colors across Parliament Hill. Black Lives Matter rallies fill streets with a new generation's demand for justice and equality. From coast to coast, people gather in vigils and marches, their breath steaming in winter air, calling for a Canada that is safer, fairer, more honest with itself. Meanwhile, Canada's relationship with its natural riches evolves. Pipelines, oil sands, and resource extraction drive heated debates about sustainability, indigenous land rights, and the future economy. Jobs and the environment feel forever at odds, yet solutions are whispered in clean energy projects, conservation efforts, and the quiet commitment of local communities protecting their rivers and forests. Canada's place in the world shifts too. Peacekeeping missions change shape, but the country's commitment to multilateralism, to standing with others rather than alone, remains strong. In foreign halls and summits, the red maple leaf flag still signals an attempt to listen, to mediate, to build bridges where others might burn them. And so, the Canada you drift through tonight is many things at once: a vast expanse of tundra, forest, mountain, prairie, and city skyline. It is the echo of a Mi'kmaq drum in the Maritimes, the lilt of a Quebecois song in Montreal, the scent of cedar smoke drifting from a West Coast longhouse. It is the mother whispering bedtime stories in Urdu in a tiny Toronto apartment. The farmer watching northern lights flicker over wheat fields in Saskatchewan. The young artist painting murals on the blank walls of Winnipeg. the elder passing down Cree words beside a crackling fire. It is a country still healing, still reckoning, still daring to dream of a future built on truth, compassion, and the understanding that its greatest wealth is not gold or oil or lumber, but people. People with different faces and faiths and food, all woven into one long, unfinished story. So breathe deeply now. Let the story settle around you like a warm blanket. In your dreams, may you stand among the towering pines and frozen rivers, hear the laughter in the cafes and the silence in the snow, feel the strength in the land and the hope in its people. This is Canada, forever unfinished, forever beautiful, forever yours to wander through, one sleepy heartbeat at a time. As you settle even deeper into the warmth of your blankets, the final strands of Canada's story for tonight weave together. This is a country whose history is never truly finished, whose dreams wander across prairies and forests and frozen tundra, where every heartbeat adds another line to its gentle, resilient tale. Imagine the generations still to come, a child born today in the glow of a northern sunrise, who will grow up with stories of old treaties and new promises. She will learn to speak both French and English, but also hear words in Inuktitut, Cree, Punjabi, Mandarin, Arabic, Somali. Her classmates will come from every corner of the globe, each carrying the hopes of ancestors who once crossed oceans or walked ancient trails. Think of the elders who guide this generation, knowledge keepers whose memories reach back to the Great Depression, the Second World War, the first time a red maple leaf flag fluttered proudly on Parliament Hill. They have watched Canada stumble and rise again, each fall a lesson, each triumph a reminder of how fragile freedom can be. Picture a family gathered at the kitchen table in a tiny house in Halifax. They trace their roots to black loyalists who fled enslavement in the American colonies centuries ago, or to Caribbean migrants who arrived during the labor shortages of the 1960s. They hold tight to recipes passed down through generations, a taste of home in every bite, a reminder that belonging is built meal by meal, story by story. In the heart of the prairies, a Cree grandmother teaches her grandchildren to beat intricate patterns, each tiny piece a word in a language older than any border. She reminds them that the land remembers, that the buffalo once thundered across these plains, and that songs sung under star-filled skies carry the wisdom of ancestors who never forgot how to listen. Farther west, on the rainy coast, a young Haida carver shapes cedar into a towering pole. His hands echo the movements of those who carved before him, centuries of artists who told their stories not in books, but in wood and paint and the eyes of the eagle and the bear. Tourists gather to admire the finished pole, but only the community knows the depth of its meaning. It is a promise that culture endures, even when history tries to silence it. Meanwhile, in the great cities, new Canadians create tomorrow's traditions. A Filipino nurse works long shifts in a Toronto hospital, whispering gentle words to a patient who fears the night. A Syrian baker opens his shop at dawn, the smell of fresh bread welcoming neighbors of every faith and color. A Jamaican musician teaches kids to play steel drums, the bright notes carrying through urban streets that once held only silence. In the halls of government, leaders debate climate targets and treaty rights, housing crises and foreign policy. They do not always get it right. No country ever does, but they hold in their hands the threads of a promise, that Canada can be not just a land of resources, but a land of fairness and hope. Activists stand in the rain, demanding that promises be kept. Farmers and scientists share seeds to protect biodiversity. Grandparents march alongside grandchildren in climate protests, knowing that the future depends on choices made today. Each voice, each sign, each footstep on the ground adds to the chorus of a people who care enough to keep questioning. Think of the landscapes that cradle this story. The mighty St. Lawrence River, flowing past old forts and bustling ports. The rugged Canadian Shield, with rocks older than memory. The endless expanse of the Arctic, where polar bears prowl and icebergs drift like silent sentinels. The boreal forests, lungs of the world, humming with the songs of loons and wolves. The Rocky Mountains, standing watch over valleys that have held families for centuries. In this vastness, Canadians find comfort in small things: a mug of hot coffee by a frosty window, a campfire crackling in a pine-scented dusk, the soft swoosh of skates carving fresh ice under a pale winter moon. These are the moments that bind communities together when politics and headlines threaten to pull them apart. And so, the Canada you dream of tonight is both old and new. It is the whisper of the treaties that still hold the potential to heal. It is the bright lights of Toronto and Vancouver, where glass towers rise over hidden alleyways of painted murals and quiet cafes. It is the warmth of a Metis fiddle at a community dance, the solemn hush of a Remembrance Day ceremony, the wild cheer of a hockey game in overtime. It is the tears shed for children whose lives were lost at residential schools, and the voices of survivors demanding that no one ever forget. It is the laughter of kids building snow forts in suburban backyards, their mittens soaked, their cheeks red, their dreams limitless. Canada is a country that apologizes when it stumbles, but more importantly, learns to stand up again, to listen, to rebuild trust, and to choose better paths for tomorrow. As you drift fully into sleep, know that this story, your story, is stitched together by countless hands and hearts, generation after generation. It is never just one person's tale, but millions, woven together by the threads of hope, memory, and the promise that each new dawn can bring something better. In the hush of your dreams, hear the snow falling softly on a quiet street, the wind singing through pine branches, the deep rumble of a train crossing the prairies at midnight. These are the sounds of Canada, wide, wild, unfinished, and always ready to welcome you home. Sleep well now, dreamer. The land of the maple leaf keeps watch. So now, dear listener, you've wandered with us through the timeless story of Canada, across ice and forest, city streets and ancient rivers, through centuries of struggle, hope, and promise. As you drift off to sleep, know that this tale is never truly finished. It lives on in every breath of the wind across the prairies, in every footstep through snow-dusted forests, and in every heartbeat of people who carry these stories forward. May you rest tonight knowing that the past, with all its lessons, whispers softly to the future, and that in listening, we find our way home. Thank you for choosing Sleepy Time History, where we bring you not-so-boring history to help you sleep. If you enjoyed this journey, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and what part of Canada's story spoke to you the most. We love hearing from dreamers like you. Until our next journey together, good night. Sleep deeply. Dream kindly. And remember, history is never just about the past. It's the lullaby that guides you into tomorrow.